Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to delve a little into some further writing by Charles Mann, the book 1493, and that was actually published in July 2012. And he's reflecting that, and I'm reading at page 514, that race, at the dawn of globalization, modern concepts of race didn't exist. Fighting off the yoke of African Islamic empires, the inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula didn't, as a rule, kill or enslave, quote, blacks, end of quote. They killed and enslaved, quote, Moors, end of quote, or, quote, infidels or idolaters. At the beginning, slavery had little racial baggage. The question that preoccupied Spaniards was not whether black or red people could be enslaved, but whether Christians could be put in bondage. Heathens, heretics, and criminals of any color were fair game. So he talks about how difficult it is in terms of categorizing people as he's going back in history and reviewing a number of things. And he says that, because of the difficulty of that, he refers to the geographic origin of the people he's discussing. But he says, I make, page 515, I make one big exception to this rule. In this book, Indigenous people are usually referred to by their ethnic names, not by a geographic label. In the modern context, it seems to me forgivable to refer to people from Yugang as Chinese, even if they would not have used that name. But it seemed foolish to refer to, say, the Inca as Peruvians. The gap between the Inca Empire and modern Peru is too great. I make exceptions to my exception. In chapter 9, for instance, I refer several times to Angloans in Palmares because it is not clear which ethnic group from that area is now modern Angola that they belong to. A bigger exception, as I imagine the reader's already thinking, is my use of the term Indian. On the simplest level, the plain sense of the word is wrong. Among other things, Indians are not from India. Red Indians, sometimes heard in Britain, is not preferred as a way to distinguish Indians from the Americans, from Indians from India. Unfortunately, alternative terms are no better. Native American, for instance, literally means someone who was born in the Western Hemisphere. My family and I are Native Americans, yet we are not Indians. Canada has introduced the term First Nations, an admirable term, but one that lacks useful adjectival and possessive forms. As a writer, I'm reluctant to inflict terms on readers that I cannot easily say. On a deeper level, Indian, Native American, and Indigenous are remote from the way the Americas' original inhabitants thought about themselves. Just as 16th and 17th century Europeans did not describe themselves as Europeans, the inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere in that same era did not think in terms of any collective entity. Today, such group nouns are important. In my experience, Indigenous Americans tend to use the word Indian when referring to their fellows. For better or worse, I'm following their example. Now this is kind of loaded, and let me take you through it. First of all, that sentence, Canada has introduced the term First Nations. That's correct. There are Indigenous nationals who believe that they thought of the concept, but the reality of it is that this was a term that Canada decided would be useful and what should be insisted upon and encouraged and marketed, if you will, to have Indigenous nationals refer themselves as. And you see the epitome of that in terms of Assembly of First Nations, the incorporated structure, carrying that through. And a lot of this dates back to when those that founded what's now called the Assembly of First Nations were involved in the Constitution, Act 1982 prior to its being passing. And there's a whole, I don't want to get into the details, but there's a whole time there of manipulating, unfortunately, those who thought they were actually succeeding. You know, it's a classic. Canada works hard to give the appearance that, okay, you got me, and you know, your agenda we accept, but really what they're doing is playing these people, and they're manipulating, and they have a plan for how they will move that forward and fit it into their own plan of termination of nations, so that the treaties would fall, so that Canada is no longer beholden to the Indigenous nations. So it's, you know, it's good to see Canada introduce that. It's not saying that the people themselves introduced that. This is why, and this just happened today, as a matter of fact, I jump on people when they are speaking about treaties and nationhood, etc. They throw in First Nations. Well, it's important to understand that First Nations is a co-opted term. First, it was planted, designed for you to adopt it and use it, and it now carries domestic legal meanings. So it's fraught with danger, and it's something in First Nations not only are legally defined in courts, for instance, but that's the terminology used for the new corporations that are formed through the self-government agreements, for example, and the opt-in legislation. So the other thing I want to really point out here, and you'll see a map, and if you'll notice that map, it shows, you know, most of what is considered Canada is kind of being empty. There's no, you know, the Haudenosaunee are there, the Wendat and such, but there's very little, and other empires, other nations are depicted here, but it looks blank. Now, when a person who isn't really versed in the issues as a professional, as an expert, looks at a map like that, it suggests it's empty. You know, terra nullis. There's nothing there, right? There's no people there. Doctrine of Discovery says, well, those that were there are beasts of the field, fauna, you know, just like the fauna and such. And so really, yes, it's considered empty. So it's important when reviewing, and the problem is this influences people, right? Non-Indigenous people, to look at this and say, okay, and then they don't have an issue with how Canada, for example, implements its policies on how to deal with things. Because, well, looking here, there was no one, there were no nations. You know, yes, I guess they are just remnants, and they should come under Canada. So it's important when looking at these kinds of, you know, how subtly, not so subtly, history's reshaped. You know, this is a book that is, you know, has so many incredible reviews, you know, as being remarkable and changing worldviews, etc. Well, you know, there may well be aspects here that are progressive, if I can use that word, in terms of relating to things, but still they can cause such damage, right? Because this person is not an Indigenous national, and he does not see things. Like, I have an eye that's highly honed to look at the dangers, right? How will an individual view that? Seeing a map that's empty, for instance. Oh, well, there was only, you know, 2 or 3 nations there, you know, that's all there was. So yeah, the rest of Canada, yes, I guess it was discovered, and I guess it does belong to Canada. And the other thing is this, especially with Section 35, Constitution Act 1982 and UN DRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this moving and detaching the people from the land. When you talk to any Indigenous national, their laws and who they are and all their relations, it's all tied to the land. You take the land away, they're no more, right? Their laws are based on their connection to all the relations and the land. So, and in particular in Canada, for instance, where there's treaties that recognize the Indigenous nations and recognize them as the owners, only granting limited permissions or partial political sovereignty to the Crown. It's really critical and concerning to read someone say, hey, this is good, you know, we've got these new group names. Well, after UNIDRIP, of course, it's Aboriginal group or Indigenous group. That's how you'll see that come up in all the news reporting. You'll see that come up in templates for agreements, etc. Replacing actual names of nations. Removing them, bringing them into sort of this kind of conglomerate that Section 35 sets out of, you know, Aboriginal peoples, Inuit and Métis, right? Bringing that as to some clumping, melting pot. You know, this is a real danger. It's important not to detach Indigenous nations of all people, Indians, from the land, from their geographical location. That's who they are. That's who they're part of. And that's all I have to say.